All right, so start. Good morning, everyone. We are going to basically start on time, and we're starting with Matt Maycock to speak because he's in Australia and it's really late for him. So Matthew is a senior lecturer in criminology at Monash University and was previously Baxter Fellow in the School of Education and Social Work, University of Dundee. He previously worked at the Scottish Prison Service undertaking research, often on gender issues in prison, as well as facilitating staff development across a range of areas. So Matt, it's your platform.
Thank you so much. And thank you for the invitation to take part. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully everyone can see that okay. So yeah, I'm Matt Maycock. It's 11 o'clock here, so apologies. I've got coffee to keep me going. So, I'm a lecturer at Monash. I recently arrived here from Scotland. So most of what I'm going to talk about relates to Scotland. And I wanted to kind of flip the focus slightly, given I'm an anthropologist, I'm interested in everyday life in prison. And I kind of wanted to think about crisis in a different way. I know the other speakers are going to talk about crisis and kind of perhaps other aspects of crisis within the prison system, but I want to reflect on what crisis within prisons means for the daily life and the daily running of prisons. So a slightly different kind of orientation. So to unpack the response to times of crisis within prison settings. So I'm speaking to you from stolen and unceded land, and I'd just like to acknowledge that specifically, this is land of the Kulin Nations, and I'd like to pay respects to elders past, present, and future. So I've been kind of doing research in and around prisons for, I guess, a little over 10 years, which seems like longer in a way. And I'm just, as a prison researcher, as a prison anthropologist, doing research in and around COVID in relation to prisons was particularly challenging, as it was for everybody. So I designed a study where I'd been going to the same prison for about 2 years before the pandemic hit. Obviously, I wasn't allowed to go in. I guess it was March 2020, around about then. So I wasn't allowed to go into the prison, but letters were. So basically, after consenting some people into a study, I wrote to a group of prisoners all the way through the pandemic, just to get a sense of their experiences, because it'd be interesting to hear other people's reflections, but there was a lot of the narrative around prison, certainly in Scotland and the UK, was, we've got this, this is a success, we are managing this crisis, there's nothing to see here, which set off red flags and concerned me. The inspection processes weren't allowed in, researchers weren't allowed in, lawyers weren't allowed in. So people who might keep an eye on what might be happening in prisons weren't getting access to these spaces. So I'm using the COVID pandemic and the crisis response as a kind of example to kind of ask wider questions about periods of crisis within prison. So there's a whole literature around riots in prisons. There's a literature around periods of segregation, which is obviously a more personal type of kind of crisis. So you're in the hardest, most detached part of prisons when you are in the segregation unit. And I'm kind of using these kind of examples to kind of reconnect with aspects of Goffman's work, which has been, certainly in relation to analyzing prisons, isn't something that people tend to use so much, and kind of people actually more, I'm thinking of Dominique Moran's amazing work, but other people too, who have kind of looked at prisons, looked at the increased porousness of these spaces. But actually, I think we need to reconceptualize that and reconnect with Goffman's work, because I think times of crisis, it could be the COVID pandemic, it could be a riot, it could be a time of segregation, actually reconfirms and outlines the prison as the total institution. So I'm going to kind of look at some data that I collected through these letters to kind of help to kind of illuminate kind of these sorts of tensions. As probably everyone was aware, prisons were quite high profile, certainly at the start of the pandemic. I'd love to hear from the other panelists from where they're working. Certainly in Europe, prisons in Italy were quite a high profile aspect of the first kind of reporting around COVID and prisons. There were some riots in some prisons in and around Milan and a couple other places. There were some really interesting kind of protests around people's families kind of protesting outside prisons and saying, can you wear your mask when you go in? Can you do this to protect my family member? All family visits were cancelled in most jurisdictions. And actually thinking about the prison industrial complex, which I know I think is going to come up in some of the other talks, there were masks made in prisons as well. So there's I do quite a lot of work on prison labor and wages in prisons at the moment and trade union activity. And there was a lot of exploitation of people in prisons to make masks because there was money to be made, and corporations made money out of prisons making masks for the COVID response. And in my experience, certainly in Scottish prisons, mask availability was a little patchy, to put it mildly. So just to kind of talk a bit about the context within which this study was located. So this is very much within the Scottish context. That's the devolved bit of the UK. There's a separate prison system there, a separate legal system. We all hope some of us hope there'll be a separate independent country. That's another story. The reporting around prisons in the local media did kind of bubble away in the background. It wasn't too high profile. There were reports of kind of staff and different outbreaks in different places. I just wanted to flag a couple of other kind of influences within the kind of wider narrative relating to COVID in prisons. Prison officer unions, which who I'm doing a bit of research with and about at the moment, they've been quite vocal in saying they want the lockdown conditions to be maintained in prison. So, and I've done a scoping review recently of all the evidence that I could find, and a team of us looked at internationally the impact of COVID in prisons. And we're finding quite a significant lag. So luckily, hopefully, wherever you are, there's not too many restrictions relating to COVID. Hopefully there are none. Within prison, there are still quite a few, still sort of remnants of that within the system. So the lag there, I think, is something that we need to question and challenge quite significantly. And there's certain voices, so senior people from the Prison Office Association, but other people too, saying, actually, this isn't a bad thing. People being in their cells 23, 24 hours a day makes our members safe because people aren't out on wing. So from my perspective, at least, that's something we need to think about and challenge where that emerges. There is some interesting emerging evidence around COVID vaccine hesitancy being higher within prison settings, and that's for some of the analysis I'm kind of reading is for kind of just people being very skeptical of anything that's offered to them in prison by the state, which is obviously keeping them there in the first place. So that's kind of a broad overview of the Scottish prison context. So as an ethnographer, sometimes of prisons, but also of other things, I tend to want to just spend as much time in prison as I can and be left alone to kind of float around as best as I can within particular prison. This obviously wasn't possible. So I started writing because it was the only thing I knew how to do. And I know there was a lot of creative responses by a lot of social scientists and other people in terms of collecting data. The letters were the best solution that I had to staying in touch with a group of people that I got to know quite well, who I was actually quite worried about as well. So the first letter I sent was a information sheet consent form. I had 8 people consent. So I really want to add some caveats to what I'm going to say. I'm not making wider claims, but the kind of general experience in prisons. This is the experiences and reflections of 8 guys that I'd known for a couple of years. So I knew that they didn't have overly significant literacy issues. Sometimes people wrote poems, sent drawings to me, which in vivo seems to struggle with, but I got a range of stuff coming back from people about their experiences of the COVID pandemic. And the things that I were hearing didn't match with the official narrative, which was, there's nothing to see here. We're managing this crisis really well. And really importantly, the second letter, when I was then writing to the 8 people who'd consented to take part, I actually just said, look, I have a reasonable insight into what's going on in that prison. I've been going there regularly for 2 years before. I just didn't know what was happening. So I kind of said, look, here's a blank piece of paper. Obviously, I sent letters in with stamped address envelopes. You tell me the important questions that need to be asked, because I don't know what's going on here. There's no inspection anymore. There's no insight into what's happening. What is important to you? What questions do you think are the important ones to ask about this really difficult time? So then I used those questions that people gave me and those kind of areas of concern, but actually the language that people used too was then reflected back in kind of later letters when I asked about specific things that were going on. So I'd use a lot of participatory methods. This was the best I could do in this context, and it's really not ideal, but there is some interesting parts to the data. So just to kind of get on to findings quickly. So the image on the right is one, you see quite a lot of these sorts of, these are kind of bits of promotional stuff that were like sent out to people in prison, pretty challenging and poor in lots of ways. But these are some of the sort of official images that were sent back to people in terms of the risk that they face, which is, yeah, I think extremely patronizing. There was a real sense of an added level of isolation, an added level of disconnection. So there's an extent to which that's a function of the prison system anyway, but there's this, I think anyone who spent time in prison, they're generally pretty noisy. There's a lot going on in the prisons that I've spent a lot of time in. There's a lot of banter, there's a lot of activity, a lot of energy around the place. That just obviously wasn't happening. There were no connections or limited connections that people could have with their peers more than anyone else, but actually not really having a reason to get up. Like some people really like to go to libraries, some people like to go to the gym, some people would work and focus on the family visit that was coming in a couple of days' time. So not having those kind of things to look forward to, and way that people negotiated their way through the system to find something that meant something to them, that was all taken away. So this kind of sense of kind of enforced, it was like a system-wide feeling of punishment. So it was almost like everyone within the prison system was in segregation. And there, earlier on in the pandemic, if you did get a positive test, that's where you went. You went to the segregation unit, which was where you go if you like got caught with, if you had a fight or whatever. So there was a sense that there was some real sort of mixed messages around kind of COVID and what it meant within sort of in terms of everyday life in prison. So there's obviously quite a rich literature around family and friend connections when people in prison in terms of reintegration. This again was really complicated by people being in prison during the pandemic. You can see on the picture on the right, it's the sort of measured out bits on the floor in a visiting room, which wasn't there before. So obviously this is like you sit here and they sit there, and there's obviously that's measured out for people. So there was kind of lots of little operational things like that, which were really difficult for people. There were lots of things that the prison system probably could have done. This is obviously the Scottish system, could have done perhaps differently. So yeah, 5 minutes, great. So there was a sense that actually the staff weren't keeping things clean. So this is, I was really kind of taken aback by this quote at the top from James, where he's talking about at this point, the only way he could communicate with his family was the phone at the end of the hall. There were other forms of communication, kind of illegal phones and stuff like that, but this is what he'd written to me. So that he was really worried about picking this phone up. This was the only way he could talk to his family. So, but he didn't want to do it because he was scared, because he knew that, or his perception was that the phone wasn't being cleaned properly. So these are the sorts of things that just kind of compounded these feelings of isolation. Nigel talked about just not having a reason to get out of bed. Just, well, obviously you're stuck in a cell for 23, 24 hours a day. Really, the point at the end, I'm writing a paper at the moment around the ways in which there's the dislocation of people being able to feel connected to their families. And so they're seeing the news like we all did. I don't want to bring up these bad memories, but we were all watching the news. We were all getting the updates about COVID. But, you know, you could call your mates, you could see your family, you knew what was going on. These people couldn't. They were getting the news. The anxiety levels were being raised, but they weren't able to say, actually, is my partner or my kids all right? Like the people didn't know. You were getting national news. You weren't getting news from your house, from your friends, from your family. So it was extremely stressful and difficult in ways that I kind of think are quite particular within prison. And a couple of politicians, certainly in the UK, quite flippantly said, oh, we all know what it's like to be in prison now because of the pandemic. I think the things that I'm talking about here show that that's really not the case. That feels quite a superficial kind of connection to make. There's other stuff happening within the prison system. Just to kind of move on, just to kind of build slightly on what I was just saying in terms of communication, there did seem to be an added level of complexity around the communication that was given to prisoners. So sometimes they would get a notice under their door about something, you know, that was happening. The normal flows of communication didn't work. And actually people have written, Ben Crew and others, are out around the ways in which information in prisons controlled. So that would mean actually, I don't know if any of the other panelists have interviewed prisoners who don't know when they're getting out and their sentence is unclear. That can happen a bit. But obviously, when you've got a pandemic and you can't talk to friends, you can't talk to a lawyer quite often, people were really kind of dislocated even further. So they were relying on prison staff to get bits of information, and that was not always a good thing to rely on in lots of ways. So there was kind of this sense that the staff were just making stuff up. The staff didn't know what was going on. People were told they were getting a personal phone that took a long time to come. So there were some things that happened that were positive, but generally just being stuck in a cell for 23, 24 hours a day was extremely challenging for most of my participants. So alongside all of that, alongside all of those difficulties and complexities, I really want to acknowledge that there were counter narratives around people actually feeling differently about being in prison during the COVID crisis. So I love this quote from Sean, not having to go to work, more time in bed, like just not having to do the shit jobs that he was expected to do was a bonus for this guy. And that needs to be acknowledged. Virtual visits, the prison service seems really proud and really happy that this has happened. I don't know why it didn't happen before, would be my question. Why did we have to wait for a pandemic for prisoners to be given their own phone and to be able to talk to family members via video chat when we're doing it now, when everyone does it? So that for me was welcome, but it should have happened a long time before. But I did interview one prisoner in a later study who actually got really upset about seeing into his living room for the first time in 10 years. His wife had changed the sofa, the wallpaper was different, and it really jarred with his image of what his living room was. So it was great to have that video connection, but actually it did cause other sorts of trauma and other issues. So I think there's a lot more research needs to be done on kind of those connections, because it feels a little bit under-analyzed at the moment. Just to kind of like conclude, I'm just conscious of the time. I think Goffman's had a bit of a tough run in criminology these days, and I kind of do feel asylums has got something in it. And what I'm trying to connect, or I'm using the response to the COVID crisis to connect to other types of crisis. And I think this illuminates a facet of the prison experience that perhaps is really easy to overlook with the closeness now with family visits and connections in other ways. So I do think that there might be something around the ways in which the response to crisis within prisons does illuminate. At the flick of a switch, the walls can feel much more impermeable. They can feel much more constricting. And that's at the whim of prison administrators largely. So I think that's pretty much me. Here's a couple of references. And yeah, happy to pass on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you. We'll move on to the next speaker and we'll take questions at the very end. Our next speaker is Dr. Sergio Grossi, and he's an international comparativist, and he's doing international comparison of best practices in education and reintegration of prisoners. He's a researcher at the I'm going to speak Italian now. Complutense University of Madrid. Did I say that right?
Yes.
Okay. Where he won a Marie Curie grant with the support of the UNESCO Chair in Applied Research for Education in Prison, and will be a visiting scholar at Columbia University in New York City. He was a researcher at the Center for the Study of Violence in Sao Paulo, and a visiting scholar at the Cambridge Institute of Criminology. Again, I'll do the same thing because I don't think I can get a chat. So I'll do 5 minutes and I'll do finish. Okay.
Perfect. Then thank you for the organization, and then I will start to talk about some research that they do, starting for the structural crisis that we had when I was working in Brazil. No? The prison system is really emblematic for the failure of the reintegration and the education policy in Brazil. This was so emblematic that the criminal organization that was born and was spread inside the prison system critical the state for not respecting the law. That was really interesting what they happened. Also, there are some criminal organizations that call himself like the trade union of crime and so on. Then in these kinds of situation when there are the overcrowding with the in the prisoner system, with nearly 1 million people now that are jailed, with the absence of educational activity, as we can see in the graph, and the working activity that only a little part of the population can do something during the day. And the majority are working inside the prison that they normally are really not really professionalization work that they cannot use when they go outside, and only a little part can get a job outside. And for example, here we can see some data of the prison system in Sao Paulo, and we can see that a huge amount of the workers inside the prison system are custody staff, and not people that have to work to help with reintegration and education policy, as we can see in this graph. With the project background of my research, it was like that Brazil is emblematic for the punishment of the poor, as the favela people, the peripheral people, and that they have a process of mass incarceration. At the same time, something that maybe in some context can be different, it seemed really strong, the parallel with the total institution of Goffman, with the bureaucratic marketing that Vacan and Garland was talking about education and reintegrational policy inside this context, but is a problem that spread around the world. It's some sort of structural crisis. In this space, I was thinking, using like critical criminology, trying to rethink what are the reintegrational policy inside the prison, and some Southern criminology study, for example, that underlines some project different in the global South. And finally, using the reference of the educational study, for example, is really fundamental, the pedagogy of the oppressed, that say that when we face a limit situation, as we can see the prisoner system, we have to understand well what happened inside for construct educational policy inside this space. For doing this, I select, I will talk, I'm studying different best practices around the world, but I select someone that I will speak quickly today. One is these kinds of prison that is in Brazil, that is really different of how we can imagine the prison in Brazil. And it was owned by the Association for the Protection and Assistance of Convicted Persons, that is a foundation that works in Brazil. And it claimed the international attention, and there are like some people in the global north, for example, in Italy, that try to inspire by this experience for build something similar. They claim that lower recidivism, that reduce the cost of the prison, and is a established experience with many years of life, with more than 3,000 of people inside this space. It was awarded also as a social enterprise of Latin America. We can see the internal area. This was really transparent. My access of the field, I do ethnographic study, was totally different as normally what we can see, because they give me the access also for sleeping inside the unity, stay all the day long, 24 hours per day for 14 days into a unit. Then I can share the life of the prisoner, of the staff totally in these kinds of space that was co-built, co-constructed by staff, prisoner, and voluntary. This is the space when they sell the production that they do inside the prison for the outside world that can enter in the space. Then it's very open and not a total institution in this sense. This is like the room when they have like visit the family visit that can include also intimate relationship, sexual relationship, and this is the space of education. And we can see, for example, the library, the artistic education, the distance learning education in a context as Brazil. And the more important specific of this model is like the peer education and the former prisoner that come back to the prison to explain how they get a new position, work position, and house and so on in outside society. The working space that this is like a prison that is also a closed prison, is not only an open prison. Then they get the possibility of constructing these kinds of prison, this space of working with complex and costly equipment, because they have a methodology for reducing the conflict inside the space. We talk on this after. And we can see like the other space inside, that was the working space. It is hard to understand who is the prisoner, who is the voluntary, who is the educator, because they are not uniform inside this space. And finally, the security, there was not armed security inside or outside. In the left, you can see like a social educator that was like the security of the space. And in the right, as a strong part of the security was the voluntary, that the idea is they have to construct like a trust relationship with the prisoner for these kinds of structure exist in a context that is very hard as Brazil. For doing this, they have developed a methodology of work with the prisoner, and as like the participation of the community is really important, the family of the prisoner, the church, the NGO, and all the people that fight for the right of the prisoner are involved for sustain these kinds of project that was lived also under the Bolsonaro government that was really harsh with the rights of prisoner. And the idea is also that the prisoner do education for the other prison, the peer education. They have to try to discuss and resolve the majority of the problem that in living together inside this space by discussing in different parts. And they have like also a big reunion of prisoner without staff, when they can discuss all the things inside the prison that are not working. There are like these kinds of space that I show that is important, is like a reintegration center, social reintegration center, that is like a quite autonomous from the direct administration, the prison administration. And for doing this, they also give more support on health, mental health and physical health, work, juridical understanding. They hire more lawyers that normally they are not so present in the prison space, because the idea is that if the people don't know when they go out and don't know, or they feel not feel well psychological or physically, they will not work the education or the integration activity. What they try to do in this system is like try to shift the paradigm in Brazil from the security of punishment to the security of reintegration and education. They convince people, the people outside, to support this project, explaining that offer possibility to the prisoner, can reduce recidivism, and can construct a safer society, and not only with the punishment. For this, they give formal and not formal education activity to everyone. Also, there was like 40 mates of 200 that was studying at the university when I was in one of these jails. And the idea is that no one is thinking as irrecoverable. There was presence of people with over 30 years of penalty and who have disciplinary problem in regular prison. Many people, there was really conflictive when they started to stay in the APAC, they trade different, they start to be conflictive and then start to accomplish with the rule and with respecting the other prisoner and the staff. There are professional education also with different work activity, with the presence of objects that are potentially weapons, that was resolved because all the people have to participate to the management of the space. They reduce the rigid division between security officer and prisoner, because many former prisoners are actually staff in this prisoner space, and also they are involved in the management of the space. There was activity the whole day, starting to 7 until 10 in the night, with also the centrality of trustworthy relationship. This unity have to be maximum 200 people and not so huge, otherwise these kinds of projects cannot work. They also do another things that they put also together people that had committed rape and pedophilia, because the idea is to clash with the code of honor of the prison system in Brazil that sometimes don't permit the people do violence with the people that have committed rape and pedophilia. And the education is not thinking only on prisoner, but in the whole society. We can see that these spaces are geographical centrality in the city. These allow and multiply the possibility that the school, the judge, the politician, the technician, the citizen come inside this space that is more transparent than normally we see the prisoner. And the testimony in the society is a part of this program also, because the people that go out testimony at the community of prisoners that is possible to reintegrate, and at the same time to the people outside that can invest and support this program and not the punishment program that is so harsh in Brazil actually. As a result of these kinds of practices, there was like different prisoners that believe in the possibility of social reintegration. There was an opportunity for socially excluded people that for the first time, for example, do regular school or access to the university or a formal job. And there was a reduction of stigma when the APAC is very well known. And the lower recidivism, also there are many studies that underline this, but is methodological complicated, and we can talk later if you want. There was some characteristic of total institution at the same time, because there are like a rigid rule internal. They was not controlled by staff principally, but the same prisoner that have to control himself and the other. And some research talk about docile bodies using like the concept of Foucault that was useful for work and not political dangerous. But at the same time, I see when I was in this space that the school, there was very many professors that collocate the prisoner system under like a critical theory of society, and at the same time there was also the prisoner that start to study, to do PhD and so on, to understand the situation of the prison. Then the stigma is still present in some of these APAC, when in particular where they don't construct a good relationship with the territory. But there was the problem in the access to the labor market, generally speaking, because there was really a huge crisis when I was doing the fieldwork. Other problem is that there are the dependence of the existence of the prison system, because if the people broke the rule, they have to come back to the normal prison. And some scholars say that the life change is considered from a strong individual perspective, but I see when I was doing the fieldwork that they work a lot with family, staff, voluntary, and the educational and juridical institutions that are object of the educational activity of the APAC system. And the low cost is another question, is because the work of prison is underpaid or unpaid. But at the same time, the staff live a contradiction, because they are not found, the government normally not found a lot education reintegration activity, and then they see, the staff see himself as a militant and for the human rights cause or voluntary, and at the same time the prisoners together are seen like this. I will talk briefly also the University of Buenos Aires in prison, that is another global south space that I will study in the next year more broadly, but is interesting because they open a part of the university inside the prison space, and there are some scholars that underline as the violence of this space are used for the prison for denouncing directly what happened inside the prison space. At the same time, there are like the educative logic that clash with the punitive logic inside this space. As we can see in the right, they organize himself, for example, in trade union, in cooperative, and so on, that was influenced by the university study. The new form of subjectivity are established, for example, the prisoner as a university student, and these enable the construction of collective discourse against the isolation of the prisoner. Then they are more visible, they construct with other social movement outside the prison. Thinking on these practices using the conception of generative justice that was developed for Fergus McNeil, Mary Corcoran, and Beth Weber, I was thinking that what happened in this space is really education for solidarity with a permanent dialogue between different parts of the prisoner community, maybe between the detained person or the detained person and the staff and the detained person, the university, and other institutions that can overcome the logic of a total institution. At the same time, for construct like generative justice, constructive solidarity, you have to guarantee like more material provision, recognize the people as people that can effectively get a new place in the society when they go out. For example, we can say that in the APAC system, the staff was hired because they trust in the reintegration of the prisoner, and and the other things that briefly, we can see that the many programs are really individualizing, and there are some programs, in particular, that the one that is studying Global South, that try to construct like a broader movement to change the prisoner system and not only focus on education of individual prisoners. For doing this, there was multiplying democratic space, improving physical and relation environment inside the space, the prisoner, building small community, caring for training and selection of staff working the facility, integration with the territory, and activity involving experts from education, criminological science, and university. Taking attention to informal education dynamic and education of society that is important to be considered. Thank you.
Thank you. So we're moving now to our last speaker. Jeffrey A. Ross is a professor in the School of Criminal Justice, College of Public Affairs, and a research fellow in the Center of International and Comparative Law and the Schaefer Center for Public Policy at University of Baltimore. He has been a visiting professor in Europe, in Germany, and in Italy. I'm just going to leave it to you now. Thank you.
Okay, I do not have a PowerPoint presentation, so please bear with me. Okay, so I want to extend my gratitude to Dr. Davut Akka for inviting me to be on the panel and the Orion Policy Institute for providing a platform for it. I'm also honored to be in the company of my distinguished colleagues, some of whom I've met, and known for some time, and others whose work I've read. And thanks for all of you for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend this event. My presentation is going to be about half the allotted time, but I think that's okay. And if you want to discuss some or all of the ideas I review, then hopefully I can address them during the Q&A opportunity after my presentation. That being said, a couple of weeks ago, Davut asked me to participate in this panel, and I agreed. My mind was immediately drawn to the famous song and album released in 1975 by the English rock group Supertramp, and that song and album is called "Crisis, What Crisis." What does that expression mean for me? Basically, if problems and challenges continue for a long time and little is done to address them, then people get used to it. Those problems and those challenges become normative. but then I started thinking, you know, more specifically about the American prison system, the prison system that I have studied the most. And I came out with the following, and my presentation is called "Calling Attention to the Current State of America's Federal Prisons and the Introduction of Legislation Aimed at Preventing Abuses." So, although correctional facilities and practices in the United States may not be as bad as those which exist in lesser developed countries, or our own prison system has routinely been criticized for having a substantial amount of correctional officer deviance, abuse, corruption, poor living conditions, including overcrowding, substandard food, poor medical and psychiatric care, among other challenges. Some experts have characterized these patterns, these events, as examples of human rights violations. Little do many Americans know, but back in February 2022, Senators John Ossoff, a Democrat from Georgia, and Mike Braun, a Republican from Indiana, spearheaded a 10-month investigation into corruption, abuse, and misconduct at the United States Penitentiary in Atlanta and within the Federal Bureau of Prisons. In order to put things in context, particularly for people who are not familiar with the American prison systems, it's important to understand that several correctional systems operate in the United States. We find this at the local level, cities, counties, state level, and the federal level. And the FBOP is the prison system that's responsible for managing individuals who are convicted of federal crimes. More specifically, about 122 correctional facilities, and according to most recent statistics, about 159,000 people. That's as much as there is in some other countries. There are numerous different types of facilities in the FBOP, ranging in different security levels, but then they also serve both men and women. Disproportionately, men are incarcerated in FBOP facilities. So, Ossoff and Braun, they conduct their investigation. It's formed under the auspices of a working group, the Senate Bipartisan Prison Policy Working Group. And what they did was they held hearings, and it wasn't just an attempt to be a fact-finding kind of process. It was also designed to come out with solutions. And so they had 4 subcommittees, not all of them focused on the FBOP. They started their investigations, public ones. They had 4 hearings, and it started in May 2021, actually. And I'm sorry, it was May 2022, and it included some controversial figures as senators who were participating in the hearing, such as Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, the top Republican person on the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Subcommittee. So among the hearings, they had a July hearing on corruption and abuse and misconduct at the BOP Atlanta prison. This was motivated by numerous complaints made by not simply inmates, but people who, families of inmates, but also people who were professionals, whistleblowers, and also there were numerous newspaper stories, news media stories about abuse that was rife not only in the Atlanta prison, but also amongst the FBOP. Just as an aside, the FBOP has been voted consistently as one of the worst places to work in the federal system. So at the Atlanta prison, inmates and especially pretrial detainees are denied proper nutrition, access to clean drinking water, hygiene products, lacked access to medical care, endured months of lockdowns with limited or no access to outdoors or basic services. And they had a big problem with rats and roaches in their food and cells. OSIF noted that the prison had the greatest number of suicides of all federal prisons from 2016 to 2021. In September, a hearing on uncounted deaths in American prison facilities included the release of a governmental accountability office report criticizing the Department of Justice that failed to report on nearly 1,000 in-custody deaths as federal law requires. In November, the hearing looked at medical mistreatment of women in ICE detention centers with predictable kinds of findings. A lot of those have been made public through the news media. In December, they also had a hearing and it looked into sexual abuse of female inmates in federal prisons. The findings also demonstrate that the BOP is failing systematically to prevent, detect, and address sexual abuse of prisoners by its own employees, including top officials. The former warden of a prison and a chaplain at the Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, California, were convicted last year of sex abuse charges. In the middle of this process, in September of 2022, Senators Ossoff, Braun, along with Dick Durbin, introduced new legislation. The legislation is called the Federal Prison Oversight Act. There was similar legislation that was introduced in the House of Representatives in the United States. We have the Senate, we have the House of Representatives. They have different mandates, but similar legislation was introduced by bipartisan team of Lucy McGrath of Democratic from Georgia, Kelly Armstrong of North Dakota. And basically what the bill wanted or mandated was that the DOJ, the Department of Justice, needed to create a prisons ombudsman to field complaints about prison conditions. You kind of wonder or scratch your head, why doesn't something like this exist already? And compel the department's inspector general to evaluate risks and abuses of all of the 122 BOP facilities. Under the bill, the DOJ inspector general would also conduct risk-based inspections of all federal prison facilities, provide recommendations to address deficiencies, and assign each facility a risk score, and on and on and on. The measure was not passed, and it died at the end of the 117th Congress, that is last year. So what happened most recently, approximately, about a month ago, April 25th, Durbin, Ossoff, and Braun, they reintroduced the bipartisan legislation to overhaul federal prison oversight. McGrath and Armstrong followed suit again in the House of Representatives. And again, the bill requires the DOJ to engage in vigorous oversight, create a new independent ombudsman. And this bill is very widely popular. It's supported by a number of predictable progressive organizations and unions too, including the Council of Prison Locals, predictably the Families Against Mandatory Minimums, National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. What's different there's some differences between the two bills. I'm not going to get into any details here. The questions, though, right now, it's in committee. There are some shortcomings of the bill, and that is, that a lot of it has to do with enforcement. It's not clear who's going to do the enforcement. Right now, I've not seen any budget allocated to this bill. It's nice to have legislation, but you also have to have some money. You have to have the appropriate resources. We all know, or most people know who work in the policy area, one way to kill an initiative is not to fund it properly or to cut back on funding. And it's not clear what's going to happen after all these reports are done in terms of who's going to be responsible for implementation, what sort of penalties will exist if implementation is not done properly, and does not appear to be any mechanism for evaluation. So Right now, that's what's going on in at least with the Federal Bureau of Prisons in the United States, at least at the legislative level. It's a positive initiative, but you know, the proof will always be in the pudding after it's passed, if in fact it's passed at all. There's other priorities that both the Senate and the Congress are struggling with. They finally just recently had to pass a budget bill, which was no easy task. And you know, the Senate is divided almost equally, you know, between Democrats and Republicans. But this bill here has bipartisan support, so something might come out of it. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we have one question in the Q&A chat, so I'm going to ask it, and then maybe I can have the privilege of asking that a few questions. So what professional courses, and I think that this is for Sergio, what professional courses would be better for prisoners in terms of reintegration? Oh, here's a second.
I answer directly. See, yeah. Yeah. Okay. Then it depends on the work situation of each country, but it's really important that is not only on professionalization, because it's important also that maybe we can offer university, we can offer all other things that normally we know that are working class, like migrants or like peripheric people that are inside the prison that don't think normally that can access to the university and so on. Then is important. The professionalization is really important, but also the broader education is important, and not only the professionalization. Then I think that this is it depends then on the different work market. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. We have a second question that has 3 parts, and it's directed to Matt and Sergio. So the question is, the tight question is, thank you panelists for your insights and expertise on the important topic. My questions go to Matt Maycock and Sergio Grossi. 1, I'm going to ask them one at a time because are there any lessons learned from the pandemic that could lead to improvements in the overall approach to rehabilitation and resocialization in the post-COVID era?
There's quite a few things, quite a few ways I could respond to that. The first is, there's a story in the Washington Post where department in the US, 11,000 people were released early because they were considered to be vulnerable in some way because of the pandemic. So they were released before their sentence would ordinarily allowed. And the data that I've seen is that only 17 of those 11,000 people then went on and committed another crime. So it's almost like a natural experiment where people have been released from prison. They clearly don't pose a threat because they're going on. Very few people are committing serious crimes as a result. So I would argue, if we can release people early from prison, why the hell are they there in the first place? So there's far too many people within the prison system, to kind of summarize that. So, and there have been certain advances. So in Scotland, they did release some people, but they were very kind of nervous about it and kind of hesitant to go as far as they could have done. But certain places, so for example, the US, where the 11,000 people have been released early, and then nothing hasn't led to a big rise in crime or other issues, which, you know, you might expect if you have a certain political view of prisoners, but that's clearly not the case. So certainly I wouldn't send as many people to prison in the first place as are going. I think certainly the bail and remand figures in Scotland are utterly appalling. So about a third of the people, of around about 8,000 people, it doesn't sound a lot probably in the US context or Brazilian, but about a third of people are waiting for a court date, which is getting further and further away because of the backlog in the system. And then they might be innocent when they get there too. So I would get people out of that waiting list. I wouldn't send people to prison in the first place, because I don't know I'd love to hear from the other panelists, but I don't know anywhere where prison works particularly well, or whether prison helps people rehabilitate. Sergio made some interesting points. I remember being in a prison in Scotland, the name of which I won't bring up, but just meeting people who are working in a sewing workshop and kind of thinking, there are no sewing factories. There's no factory of that type in the UK anymore. There may have been in the 60s. I don't know. I wasn't alive then, but there certainly wasn't then. The other job that some people were doing were breaking down the digi boxes that we all used to have on our TVs. There was containerfuls of those that had been got from somewhere, and there was a chip in them that was worth something. Not a lot, but if you had thousands of them. So the guys in this prison were also breaking down these boxes and getting this chip. And I'm thinking, again, I don't see those jobs like coming up in the job pages. So there's a disconnect there. And I think Sergio could probably really talk more fully about things could be done. A, less people should be in prison, but B, if they're there, a lot more meaningful activities could be taking place.
Yeah, sure is the less people that have to be in prison, but also we have to construct like other services outside, because, for example, there are a lot of people in prison that are homeless people, or have not family relationship, or have not the capacity of work. Then if we have not a space outside for helping the people, for the broader people, not only the prison, I think on homeless people and other part of population that have not this possibility, it will be complicated that the people stay in the outside society. In Brazil, is very punitive, the society, if you have not work, if you have not house, and so on. Then I think that what we learn is that we have to construct like more broad for thinking the prison reintegration. We have to think the prison inside the broader social policy as housing, work, and so on. And other things that the prison can be really more open, because we have tried with the Zoom, with the application and so on, that don't necessarily pose a threat of security. And then we had used it in the COVID, and I think that it's good that we don't go back. And I think that definitely the prison can be open also for the people that are inside the prison more and more, as we see in the COVID crisis. Also, another thing that I learned specifically was like that in a last study that we do with a criminal organization running in São Paulo prison, is that the criminal organization can be supportive with prisoner. And for example, in São Paulo, we find that they try to avoid that the prisoner do riot, because they will contagious themselves. And then with a government that was like really with the politic of open the prison and space to the society, the criminal organization tried to defend the health of the prisoner or the spreading of the COVID crisis. Then that something really strange can happen responding in the case when the prisoner can organize himself in some time in a form of criminal organization. And this is another thing that and then sometimes the criminal organization inside the prison system as popular because are not popular what the state do, you know, what the state do inside the broader space. Yeah.
So we have actually two more questions other than this. So let me just continue that question. There are two more points in that question. One is, how can technology be leveraged to enhance access to rehabilitation programs and support prisoners, both during and after the pandemic? And the second one is, what policy recommendations would you suggest to ensure that the rehabilitation and resocialization process remains a priority, even in times of no crisis or crisis?
Funnily enough, I met with someone who's working on some apps relating to rehabilitation, and I felt very nervous about the conversation that I had. It feels like an expansion of the carceral state, and it feels the back channel kind of data that come with these apps, and actually correction services thinking we don't need to pay all these social workers going around. We've got an app, it's going to save us a ton of money, and actually we get really rich data about the people we're trying to kind of surveil. So I'm not a Luddite, maybe I am, but I think there's concerns definitely around the data and kind of some of the human rights aspects of that. Fergus McNeill wrote a beautiful book called Pervasive Punishment about the expansion and the ways in which the criminal justice system's expanding in quite nefarious ways, and technology is facilitating a lot of that. So I'm pretty skeptical. Maybe that's not a very good answer.
Yeah, I think that also it's really important, as I show, that you know, also social work sometime and social education and so on, reintegrative all the reintegrative stuff are really individualizing perspective and not necessarily critical. Then sometimes they cannot organize himself, they cannot organize really other kinds of spaces. The APAC happen, or for example, the university in prison in Argentina. Then I think that the fundamental is that the reintegration policy is inside a discussion that unifies social question with the prisoner question, you know. Then if also the staff, all the staff and the prisoner start to understand that there are structural responsibility also, because they are jailed, because they are inside the prison, that it can change something. Involving public opinion, then take out the prison system to the to being a matter of expert is fundamental for breaking the chain of criminalization, and construct a different form of social policy and then social justice, I think. Then.
Okay, thank you. There's one question that says that is a great diverse panel from 3 different continents and insightful presentations from different contexts. Do you see any PRISM model from a specific country that can be considered as a model system for other countries?
I'll jump in. I'm not, although I have visited prisons in Finland and in Sweden, I do believe that the Scandinavian experiment, from what I've read and what little I've seen, does hold some promise. And a lot of that has to do with the resources these countries have pumped into their correctional system, their criminal justice system. That includes more humane kinds of housing facilities, and the ratios of correctional officers, correctional workers to inmates, and to the kinds of programming that they provide people who are incarcerated, which is, you know, in a contradiction to what is happening, at least in the United States and many of the other advanced industrialized democracies. So I think that's where we need to look if we want a model. I know that it's not perfect, but it has also led to decreases in crime, at least reported crime, in the Scandinavian countries. Things are changing, and that's to be understood. You know, the amount of crime, the kinds of people engaging in, and criminal justice agencies are always in flux based on, you know, different things, people coming into the organizations, new leadership, new policies, COVID, for example, crises, that sort of thing. So that would be my gut reaction to that question.
Alongside the sort of Nordic countries, the Netherlands is quite an interesting place too, where they've closed a lot of prisons, and they actually, I think, lease out at least one of them to another country to kind of so there's different policy approaches that means that they don't need prisons anymore. People are diverted into mental health services and other services, as opposed to the default being prisons. So that would be an interesting place too. It's again not a perfect example, but there's some interesting stuff going on there.
Yeah, exactly. What I show is one system that can be interesting, but in fact, what I was thinking that more that the people, the prisoner system try to do the reintegration policy, and less are prison and more are social service. Then then are more supportive than punishment. And in fact, they transform the prisoner system in like some kinds of supportive space, and that is it can be really useful for people that have not family or not social support outside. Yeah.
I think we're done with the questions on the Q&A. Can I ask a question or maybe push an argument? If in Foucault's notion of prisons and punishment, the idea developed from, visibility to then hiding punishment to prisons, right? Is it time now for us to challenge the idea that punishing through prisons isn't really working, and that while prisons look like total institutions, the reason why people commit crime is not because they are evil people and we can put them in a closed surrounding and have them rehabilitate by, reading a religious book of some sort. Is it time for us now, specifically in the US? I mean, what you heard about the US is the best system, and that's the federal system. Now you go down the other systems, things are not as good as even the federal system. Is it time for us to start questioning how we punish? I mean, I heard Matt saying releasing people from prison doesn't, is not such a bad idea. And we had an experiment there in the DC area. Is it time for us to start talking about reconfiguring the punitive ideology in the world at this point?
I think that's been going on for some time, and I think if we're to believe I guess what we're taught and the statistics, and I have no reason to believe that it's not accurate. We increased, many countries increased a movement towards releasing people from prisons during the 1960s and putting them on alternative types of supervision, like community supervision, like parole, increasing things like a release on recognizance. But that has not been a perfect solution, because it's led to increased surveillance, extending the net, that sort of thing. So I think the prison system should be continuously scrutinized, whether or not it whether or not it achieves one of its principal goals of punishment. In fact, I think among the 4 major goals of the correctional sanction, prisons, jails, and other correctional facilities do a pretty good job of punishing people. And it's the other things that they are poor at, and that is, deterrence, rehabilitation, and also providing some sort of community safety. So I think there's better ways to deal with, people who, break the law, and it starts back. And that prisons and that prisons or correctional facilities are generally the place of last resort, and so there's other things that need to be put into play, and that comes to our educational system, our tax base, the provision of social services, health and welfare kinds of things. So those are more deep kinds of questions that need to be continuously addressed, and seeing prison as the place of last resort, or the correctional sanction.
I think it's such an important challenge for us as criminologists. People have been critiquing prisons for as long as there's been criminology, and as long as there's been prisons, I don't know about the other people on the panel. I meet people all the time who don't know, or they're interested in prisons, they've never been to one. And you get the narrative, it's just so easy in there, mate. Like, people have got TVs, and I'm like, come with me tomorrow. Come and have a look. It's pretty shit in there. It's horrible. It's not a good place to be. But for me, there's something that worries me, that we can be writing papers, we can have conversations like this, but I don't know about the other contexts that the panelists are working in, but there's new big prisons being built all the time. There's evidence emerging that prisons maybe aren't an effective use of public money, and yet they're still being built and still getting bigger. So I mean, that is probably something we need to reflect on as a discipline. Perhaps maybe we're not saying the right things, or people aren't listening, but there is a disconnect around the growth of the prison population, the growth of prisons, and the critique of it being long-standing and quite consistent, I think.
Yeah, I totally agree. Then I think that the big challenge was like taking that crime is a social conflict. We have to understand how to solve the social conflict that are under the prison crisis. Then someone maybe like the economic one. I think that the prison have to be avoided totally, because we know that the majority of the people in prison are for economical reason that do these kinds of crime. But then there was like some complex aspect more. For example, in Spain, we are discussing a lot the punishment for the people that commit like gender assault or rape or so on. Then this is another space that. But definitely, what I think that we have to research more how to lead the difference on this form of conflict, then that we can avoid the use of the prison. Then otherwise, if we don't solve the conflict, some people outside this space will claim for more and more jail, because this is the easy, kill the problem or eliminate the problem from the society is the easy way for not taking in consideration the social problem beside the crime. Then I think that we have to do like more research on applied conflict transformation management, maybe, and so on in this different case.
Okay, we have no more questions. Any comments that you want to make? Final comments? I think we can. We have a little bit of time for that. Okay. All right. Thank you so much. It was really nice to meet some of you. It's nice to see some of you after a while. I haven't seen some of you for a while. And if we see you at ASC, maybe we will have a little bit of more of a conversation. So thank you. And thank you, Davut, for taking care of this. Oh, there's one more comment. Hold on. Last second. So somebody just thanked you once again. Thank you for your time, expertise, and dedication to this important subject. Your contributions have made this webinar a resounding success. Best regards. So thank you, and have a good rest of your day, or have a good night's sleep.